Recording.
Okay, so welcome everyone to another virtual workshop of the Accounting Design Project. My name is Andrea Tillett. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and our speaker today is David Veenman from the University of Amsterdam, who will be sharing his paper on the seasonal variation in cash flows and the timing role of accruals. So just a few housekeeping rules before we get started. Please remember to mute your microphone so that we can avoid excess background noise while the speaker is presenting. If you feel comfortable doing so, please share your video so that we can have more active engagement and participation throughout the workshop. And if you have any questions or comments, please use the raise hand feature or just drop them in the chat box and I'll call on you in the order that those come up. And we typically give the speaker the first 5 minutes uninterrupted. So David, with that, feel free to take it away.
All right, thanks Andrea for the introduction and for moderating the session. And thanks to Ayung and Stephen for accepting the paper into the program. This is nice timing for me. I'm in the middle of a heavy teaching period, so it's nice to have a break from teaching and talk about research again. And of course, this is a topic that's also close to actually what I'm teaching, which is FSA. So that's a nice link. It's also perfect timing in the sense that we're about to start a major revision of the paper. So there's a lot we still need to do regarding the empirics, but especially also in terms of the exposition of the paper and the motivation. So any feedback that you have would be extremely welcome. So yeah, anything you have as feedback for us would be very well appreciated, either in the session or after the session. So let me start. So the paper is called Seasonal Variation in Cash Flows and the Timing Role of Accruals. And this is co-authored work with Martin Capons, who was my colleague in Amsterdam until a year ago, until he moved to INSEAD. So let me start with an example. So if we look at Amazon over the period from 1998 to 2022, we can see that Amazon has huge seasonal variation in its cash flows. So we see here the red line depicts the quarterly cash flows for Amazon scaled by total assets. But if we look at earnings, we see that earnings have a much more stable pattern and much less volatility. And so one thing we observe here is that there's huge seasonal variation in the cash flows of Amazon. Interestingly, and that relates to something we examine later, we also see that the seasonal variation actually becomes weaker over time. Now, if we look at cash flows and accruals, we can see that if we sort of look at the pooled sample relation between cash flows and accruals, we see that there's a pretty strong negative relation between operating cash flows and operating accruals on the other hand. And what is interesting here is that this negative relation also relates to clear the seasonal variation in the cash flows and accruals of Amazon. Yeah, so here we see that the Q1 cash flows of Amazon tend to be negative and the Q4 cash flows tend to be positive. And the operating accruals are the flip side of that. Now, what's interesting is that if we move to the annual measurements, this negative relation completely disappears, right? So there's no clear relation here. And it appears that there's some extreme outliers here that tilt the relation even to a positive one. Now, this is an interesting observation, also in light of the fact that recent research has looked into the relation between annual operating accruals and operating cash flows, and has drawn some strong conclusions regarding this relation. What is also quite interesting is that if we move back to the quarterly patterns, we can see that actually the scale of this graph stays the same, even though we aggregate the 4 quarters together, right? And that's consistent with the negative autocorrelation in both the cash flows and accruals, which are offset, which does not result in a higher variance of the operating cash flows and accruals when we aggregate the 4 numbers together. Yeah, so a clear insight from this analysis is that we see here that the seasonal variation in both cash flows and accruals is obscured in the annual measurements. Now, what is the objective of our paper? The objective is to study the properties of operating cash flows and the associated operating accruals using quarterly specifications that allow for the effects of seasonal variation. Now, the question is, of course, why do we do this? So one motivation is that several studies in recent years have shown that the annual relation between accruals and cash flows has significantly reduced or weakened in recent decades, up to this relation being almost zero in recent years. Now, we believe it's important to revisit this relation for the reason that quarterly specifications provide additional variation in cash flows and accruals that is not available at the annual level. And this is something we saw in the Amazon example. Right? Apart from the seasonality, one specific reason to focus on shorter measurement intervals, and this actually goes back to the Chow 94, is that many firms' operating cycles, and specifically their operating cash cycles or the cash conversion cycle, if you will, are substantially less than a year, right? And this just implies that for most firms, the working capital accruals, they originate and reverse within the year rather than that they transcend the year. Now, then the second point relates to the Amazon example, where we say that even in a steady state firm where we know that accruals may be playing a less important role, and where net operating assets do not significantly change at the annual level, there can be significant volatility in accruals due to the seasonality in companies' operations and their related working capital management. And then finally, related to all of this is that quarterly specifications provide a structure that can link operating cash flows and accruals to the underlying operations. And here, the example, again, going back to Amazon, is a company that has its peak quarter and it's building up inventory and receivables around that quarter and is building up payables and unwinding the payables before and after the peak season. Now,
David, we do have our first question in the chat. If you want to, so Sudipta has a...
Sure. Go ahead.
So is the decreasing variance that you showed us in the previous, maybe a couple of slides ago, for accruals, is that just driven by a steadily increasing denominator because Amazon has just invested in warehouses, invested in delivery trucks, invested in inventory a lot more than they used to?
You mean this weakening on the left-hand side? Yeah, and your point is that this could be driven by the deflation by assets?
Yeah, because the assets have become more and more tangible because they're building warehouses all over the country, buying vans for delivery all over the country. So there's a lot more tangible assets in the denominator than there used to be when they were just shipping.
Yeah.
And didn't have to carry that much, right?
That's a good point. So later on in the paper, we try to find explanations for sort of the systematic pattern in the seasonal variation in cash flows that we find sort of in general. And that could be one factor that plays a role.
But you also see this pattern in the cash flows. The operating cash flow variability has also come down at the same time.
Yeah.
So it suggests there's something systematic going on. And it's probably the denominator.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something we'll definitely look into. Thank you. Okay. Can I move on?
Yes.
I'll move on. All right. So so I provided the motivation, sort of more of the ex-ante motivation, conceptual motivation, and then empirically, what we find is that actually seasonal variation is very systematic for a large group of firms. Yeah, and again, the point is that the seasonal variation is obscured in annual specifications. Now, the seasonal variation is much weaker in earnings than it is in operating cash flow. So that's also visible from the Amazon example. And this hints at a potentially significant role for accrual accounting, right? So the Amazon example, if I go back here, right, suggests that the earnings are much less volatile than the underlying operating cash flows, which hints at a significant role for operating accruals. And this is something we find more systematically in the aggregate. Now, what is important is that if we think about seasonal variation in cash flows, this is a different concept than the regular seasonality we know when we speak about the seasonality in a firm, right? The firm that has peak Q4 because of the holiday season. So I have two examples here. So again, Amazon, and another example is Deere, which is a completely different firm. But both of them have their peak operating cash flow quarter in Q4 and the lowest operating cash flows in Q1. But again, these are completely different firms in terms of their operations, because first of all, their peak seasons differ. Yeah, so for Amazon, it's clearly Q4, but for Deere, it's more the spring and summer period, which is around Q2 and Q3. And also their working capital policies are completely different. So Amazon, for example, has a cash conversion cycle of minus 41 days, while Deere has a cash conversion cycle of more than a year. Yeah, so the point here is that seasonal variation in cash flows is a completely different concept than the regular seasonality that we talk about when it comes to seasonality in sales. Now, what do we do? What do we find? So first of all, a major part of the paper is that we start with the Jiao, Kothari, and Watts paper in 1998, which provides this model of working capital accruals and cash flows. And what we do is we extend that model to the quarterly setting. And we, instead of focusing on a random walk sales process, we actually model the seasonality across the quarters within a year. And by doing that, what we do is we illustrate how seasonal variation in cash flows can be depicted as a function of both the seasonality in sales and firms' working capital policies. Yeah, and the seasonal variation in cash flows triggers working capital accruals in the opposite direction so that the accruals offset the shocks in cash flows. Now that's the conceptual part. Empirically, we find that seasonal variation in cash flows is an economically significant determinant of variation in quarterly accruals. Now we find a strong negative relation between quarterly cash flows and accruals, specifically when we focus on working capital accruals, which are the most logical counterpart of the operating cash flows. And second, and this is an important point, when we account for cross-sectional differences, either with firm-fixed effects or with change tests. And this is an important point because if we look at prior related work that looks at the accrual cash flow relation, that typically does not account for heterogeneity across firms. This is important because sort of the actual relation between accruals and cash flows does not have a solid conceptual foundation in the literature. And if you look back into the literature, for example, the Jiao, Kothari, and Watts, they actually model the relation between changes in cash flows and changes in accruals and provide the theoretical basis for that. Yeah? And the theoretical basis for the examination of the relation between levels of accruals and cash flows does not exist. Now, another important result is that we find a sharp decline in seasonal cash flow variation in time. Yeah? So we find systematic shifts in the economy, where at the beginning of our sample period, there's a much more significant seasonal variation in cash flows than there is at the end of the period, at the end of the sample period. Now, then we start exploring what could drive this change, and key factors that drive this change are the reductions in inventory holdings and increasing days payable, which feed into a reducing cash conversion cycle over time. Yeah? And that links back to our analytical modeling of the Jiao, Kothari, and Watts model, where we say that the seasonal variation is a function of both the sales seasonality and the specific working capital policy parameters. And then lastly, what we find is we try to explore some more of the reasons for these changes over time. And we find that, consistent with the Srivastava paper, there's a cohort effect when it comes to firms' inventory holdings. So more recent cohorts of firms have lower inventory holdings. Well, if we look at the days payable effect, that seems to be more of a systematic economic trend. I think there's another question. Is there, or?
Yeah, so I asked about comparison between Amazon and Deere, because you pointed out that they're in different industries, but they may also have different business models.
Correct.
So specifically, does Deere have a big financing arm, in which case it does want to delay collecting on the payables because it's going to collect a lot of interest? So that is a very different model than Amazon, which wants to collect quickly to recycle. So, I mean, without sort of considering whether they have a similar business model, the comparison on the sort of timing doesn't seem, all the auto car companies have huge credit card businesses, which are sometimes even bigger than the manufacturing business.
Yeah.
And so I just want to understand what you're assuming in the comparison.
Sorry, can you repeat the last
I
part?
just want to understand what you're assuming in making that comparison. Are you assuming they're the same business model?
No, definitely not. So I actually wanted to make the point that these are firms with completely different business models, different working capital policies as a result. But we see the same patterns in the seasonal cash flow variation. So the point is that seasonal cash flow variation is different from sales seasonality because of these different business models and different working capital policies. Yeah. Ayung, you raised your hand?
Yeah. Hey, David, I think this is, you're on the slide of all the key insights, right? And then I think one of the implications of your finding is for accounting researchers who have employed quarterly specifications, and there's heterogeneity issue that they are overlooked looking onto your paper. But I think at the beginning of your talk, you talk about that there are potentially some implications for financial statement analysis or investors in general. So I'm kind of like just wondering that what type of investors will be interested in those potentially within year variations, and potentially they are probably more interested in very short-term news, right? What exactly is kind of like the message we have for investors or for the practice from knowing those that within year variations? Are those transitory variations, or those are kind of persistent from year to year? Somehow they can form some trading strategies based on what we observe here.
Okay, so I don't know about the trading strategies, but I think sort of all of this discussion underscores the sort of the reason why the focus is so much on quarterly earnings, right, instead of quarterly cash flows, right? So, and this is where the role of accrual accounting comes in. Accrual accounting helps to make the quarterly earnings a more stable and more persistent measure of performance, right? So if you think about basing in investing strategies on accounting fundamentals, then unless there's some systematic mispricing, I think the earnings provide a much more solid basis than the quarterly cash flows. So to me, that would be one of the key insights. Does that help?
Yep. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Let's see. So this is sort of the broad idea of the paper, what we do. So there's the conceptual component, and then the large empirical component we have. Now, how do we hope to contribute to the literature? So first of all, we hope to contribute to the general literature on accounting accruals, and specifically the timing role of accruals. So first of all, right, we know that a function of accruals is to create temporary and temporal differences between cash flow income and accrual income, which leads to hopefully to a more informative measure of performance. Now, the timing role of accruals should, at least in theory, produce this more informative and less volatile measure of performance. And prior research has indicated that this timing role, at least in theory, should lead to a negative correlation between changes in accruals and changes in cash flows. At the same time, right, there is this debate in the literature that looks at the timing role of accruals and indicates that it's not clear that accruals still play this prominent timing role, at least in recent times, right? So there's the literature that looks at the accrual cash flow relation, and there's this literature that looks at the predictability of earnings or accrual-based earnings versus operating cash flows. Now, what we believe is important is, again, that annual measurements obscure the seasonal variation and therefore obscure a key timing role of accruals. Now, at the same time, as I hinted earlier, so prior research has focused on examining the relation between accrual and cash flow levels. But this is not well suited to identify the timing role for two reasons. So first of all, as we identify, the conceptual foundation of that is relatively weak or non-existent. And second, there are the effects of firm level heterogeneity, which leads to the importance of either controlling for firm fixed effects or, again, looking at changes in accruals and cash flows. Now, then more generally, right, we contribute or hope to contribute to the accrual literature. And I think one of the key contributions we aim for is to provide a better understanding of the accrual generating process. And this is, of course, important if, for example, you think of the modeling of non-discretionary quarterly accruals, right? Then we need to have a solid conceptual understanding of what are the key factors that drive accruals in a normal situation before we start examining what we would call abnormal or discretionary accruals that deviate from those normal conditions. And then finally, we contribute to the literature that looks at temporal trends in accounting properties. And I guess the key contribution we have here is that we find a systematic shift in cash flow properties, and specifically the systematic shift in the seasonal variation in cash flows. Sudipta, you have
just a quick clarification question. When you talk about accruals, do you mean working capital accruals, operating accruals, or all accruals, including financing and investing?
Thank you. So apologies for not clarifying this. Our focus is on operating accruals. And empirically, we make the distinction between working capital accruals and non-working capital accruals. Yeah, so we ignore the investing and financing accruals in this paper. And the reason we focus on operating accruals is because we want to have an accrual that compares well to operating cash flows. And in that sense, the working capital accruals are the better comparison. Yeah, thanks. Okay, so those are at least our aimed contributions to the literature. Yeah, so generally, or more generally, right, we aim to contribute to this literature that looks at time trends in accounting properties. Now, some background, I think I mostly touched upon this already, but one important insight from the Chow 94 paper is that the role of accounting accruals is more important when performance measurement intervals are shorter. So that's something that we re-emphasize in our paper. Second, when operating cycles or operating cash cycles are longer. And finally, when firms have more volatile working capital investment and financing needs. So if we look at the Chow 94 paper, then a key message there is that when firms have more volatile working capital needs, then accruals play a stronger role in offsetting shocks in cash flows. But if we think about a steady state firm, right, there she actually explains that accruals play less of a role and that cash flows or cash-based earnings and accrual-based earnings are much closer to each other. Now, the key contribution that we make here is that we say, well, even for a steady state firm, we can have significant accrual variation due to the fact that firms have seasonal businesses and as a result, seasonal variation in their cash flows. Yes, please, Sudipta.
So another thing she points out is a positive correlation between current accruals and future operating cash flows. Under accrual accounting, you'd expect that.
Correct.
So, and Dicha and Dicha sort of look also at deferrals, which is past cash flows. So I'm wondering why you're focusing only on current cash flows instead of looking at this set of cash flows.
Yeah, so
accrual accounting.
Yeah, so one reason we started by looking at the accrual cash flow relation is that's basically motivated by the recent studies that came out. We do have at the back of the paper we switched to this cash flow prediction where we look at how cash flows versus cash flows plus accruals have predictive power for future operating cash flows and operating earnings. Right? So you make an important point that we can actually do both, and that both provide different evidence on the timing role of accruals. Yeah. All right. So let's see, where was I? So yeah, a key point here that I want to make is that even in a steady state firm, right, there can be significant variation in accruals due to the seasonal variation in cash flows. Yeah. Now the conclusion of Bushman et al. 2016 is that the correlation between accruals and cash flows has largely disappeared in more recent years. And the key conclusion there is that this relation is mostly obscured by the recognition of non-operating one-time items in earnings. Now, this recent paper by Green et al. And Jar, what they say, well, the disappearance of the negative relation between accruals and cash flows is actually explained by this the increased intangible nature of firms' investments. Right? So if we think about R&D investments and investments in advertising, then these are negative operating cash flows, but we don't see the consequences of them back in accrual measures. Right? So what they do is they fix both operating cash flows and operating accruals, and then they find that in a regression of accruals and cash flows, that the coefficient on cash flows no longer changes over time. Now, what is important for us is that a significant source of variation in cash flows remains unexplored because of the focus on annual measurements in prior research. And second, as I alluded to earlier, right, there are empirical concerns related to the inferences from cross-sectional patterns. So that links back to the Bala and Nikolaev paper, which is about cash flow prediction. So how cash flows versus earnings predict future cash flows. They make the point that it's important to account for cross-sectional differences. We make the same point, but then in this context of the accrual cash flow relation. Now here are, yes, Stephen.
Yeah, I presume you're using the same definition of accruals as the Chow and all these other people, right?
Yeah.
Can you define the accruals for us?
For us, so the focus is on operating accruals. So our definition of accruals is the net change in non-cash net operating assets.
Okay, well, this is where I have a problem. We've talked about this off camera, so maybe this is more benefit for the audience than otherwise. So let's just take revenue, okay? Revenue accrual. And that's the change in accounts receivable. Now, the change in accounts receivable, I believe as I teach it, and I think in practice, you debit the accounts receivable with the revenue accrual on credit, and you credit it with the cash. So the accrual, the accounts receivable accrual is partly cash.
Mm-hmm.
So if in a quarter you have a lot of cash being paid off, you're going to have a reduction in the change in accounts receivable. In the next quarter, when you get more sales on credit, you're going to have an increase in that. But the following quarter, you're going to have the payoff of that, which is going to create the whole volatility. So it seems to me the idea that there's a negative correlation between accruals and cash flows is entirely by construction, that the more cash flows you have, the lower your change in accounts receivable. And that's, in my mind, a whole problem with the whole literature, that the change in accounts receivable and the other operating accruals is not accruals. It's partly determined by cash, the accrued expenses, the accounts payable, and so on. So it seems to me that you're not picking up the accruals. Cash is part of the change in accounts receivable. So by construction, you've got to have a negative correlation, and you've got to have that downward sloping quarterly thing that you had on the first graph by construction of how the accounting works. It's nothing to do with operational features and so on, and seasonality.
Well, yeah. So I think I think so. We talked about this last summer, right?
Yes, we talked about it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're actually on the same page to a large extent, and I think that a significant degree of this negative correlation is indeed a mechanical one, right?
Yes.
If accounts receivable are paid, right, we have a negative accrual, and we have a positive operating cash flow, right? So in that sense, there's a -1 correlation, minus 1% correlation. So I think that makes it particularly interesting that in recent research, right, we don't see this negative correlation anymore. So even if it's mechanical, right, it apparently has disappeared. Now, of course, if we think about right, the initial recognition of the of a sale on credit, right, there, right, this negative correlation is not obvious, right? So there's no cash flow involved in the initial recognition of a sale on credit, right? So I think, yeah. So to me, it's not obvious that this negative relation is completely mechanical.
No, it may not be completely mechanical, but I think it says you should be working with the revenue accrual, which is the debit to accounts receivable. Okay. So a debit to accounts receivable, we sold more stuff on credit, but we have lower cash flows because the cash flows are typically for the previous period. Okay. And the next period, then you get the cash flow with a delay. That can induce the volatility, but that is sort of the timing issue I guess you're getting at. Okay. But it seems like that is just, if you have revenue on credit, you don't have the cash flow yet. Okay, you get the cash flow later. And so it means that you should be studying the timing of the debits to accounts receivable and the timing of the credits to accounts receivable, which are the cash flows. Now, revenues, of course, there are sales on credit also, for cash also, okay, which you'd have to build in. But it seems to me that would be the way to approach it.
Yeah. Yeah, so and so I think what is important is that if we, for example, think about the payments of the receivables, so cash comes in, receivables go down. So to me, right, this is still a positive operating cash flow and a negative operating accrual, which is important because the sort of, to me, the accrual ensures that the positive cash flow does not enter the income statement, right? Because the income has been recognized already, revenue has been recognized previously. So in my definition, right, this is still a relevant accrual because it ensures that the positive operating cash flow is recognized in the balance sheet instead of the income statement, right? And to me, that's why I focus on the definition of changes in net operating assets as the definition of accruals.
Yeah, I think that's the way to look at it, that actually the cash flows don't, in some sense, cash flows don't affect the income statement. They just affect the balance sheet. They just affect the credit to accounts receivable.
Yeah.
The same with inventory and accounts payable. You pay off your accounts payable at a certain time, but the cost of goods sold in the inventory goes to the income statement under accrual accounting when you have the sale. So the timing is by construction just different. Okay. And so I guess in some sense you're studying the difference. If you want to look at substantive aspects, business aspect, the difference of why there is this different timing difference, a delay in paying your receivables more, your payables more, or collecting more in different industries.
So I think the discussion sort of doesn't take into account that the technology of collecting receivables has changed over time, right? So we used to have just factoring of receivables back in the day from banks. And then we went to securitization of receivables. And then more recently, we've started doing reverse factoring and whole lots of other things that essentially pays the company off quickly. Small interest costs, but that collection, the time that Stephen is talking about, I think empirically, if you look at the data, you'll find that sort of the receivables turnover, let's say, has shrunk over time, or the days too. And so I think that is explaining why we're going towards the zero, but that's got nothing to do with the accrual accounting. It's to do with the technology of collecting cash from customers, credit customers.
Sure. Yes, I agree. And right, the accrual accounting has sort of stayed constant, but it's the underlying economics that changed, which lead to different properties in cash flows and accruals. Yeah, I think that's a key point we want to make. And related to that, right, another example is the recent rise of supply chain finance. This has significantly lengthened the days payable outstanding, which also affects, right, the operating cycle, which has an effect on the operating accruals and cash flows. Yeah.
I think it also has to do with sort of market position, whether you're a monopolist or a monopsonist. Okay.
Yeah.
Apple can force me to pay straight away. Okay. It can force its suppliers, wherever they are in Chengdu or Vietnam, wherever they are, say, look, you don't give me 30 days credit. You give me 60, you give me 180 days credit. Okay. Because if you want to trade with Apple and get on this value chain, I'm going to screw you. Okay. So I think it has to do with the monopoly position and the monopsony position, holding the technology of collection constant, because you really work to get the float, and the ability to get the float is very important to value generation. And insurance companies do it very well, of course, and banks do it well. So I think that's an important ingredient too.
Yeah. Yeah, so and this is something that relates more to what we do in the back end of the paper, but something also that we still need to work on a lot to get a better sense of what is driving, right, these changes in the working capital policy parameters. So what is driving this increased days payable outstanding and the difference between days sales and payables outstanding over time. I guess that's what we believe is the most exciting part of the paper, right? And how this feeds into the seasonal variation in cash flows. But we have a lot of work to do in that space.
It's also changing production technology. So if you think about Dell computers, it takes an order and then produces the computer. So it basically collects cash when you place the order, and then it just orders parts from suppliers who are local, it assembles and ships it out. But then they have a negative, cash flow thing too. But that's because the production technology has improved so much that you don't need, and the supply chain technology has improved so much that you don't need to hold inventory at your location. You only get inventory when you need it. Right? The just-in-timeness has increased a lot. And so that production side also affects, this whole thing.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. So let me not speak about these examples too much, but basically what I wanted to show here is that this is the Amazon example that you saw before. Deere is the other example that I mentioned. A clear, very strong negative correlation between quarterly accruals and cash flows. Again, we have Q1, Q4, but when aggregated at the annual level, this relation becomes much weaker, right? We still see the negative relation, but the spread is much wider, right? So the R squared, the fit of this relation is much weaker. Now here we have some quotes from the 10Ks from these companies, and they explicitly mention, right, the seasonal variation in cash flows that results from the seasonality in demand and the combination with their specific working capital policies. Now then let's look at the analytical modeling. So we start with the Zhao-Kothari and Watts model, where sales follow a random walk, but we modify the framework to allow for 4 quarters of revenues, where the 4th quarter has a seasonal peak, and we allow the seasonal peak to vary based on our side parameter here. Now I'll spare you the details of exactly what we do, but essentially what you see here in the top of my screen is we have specifications for 4 quarters for accruals. So this is accruals in Q1, accruals in Q4. And essentially the first part here is what DKW model in their paper. And the second part here is what we get when we allow for seasonal variation in cash flows. And this shows us that both accruals and the operating cash flows have specific patterns across the fiscal quarters, where these differences across the quarters depend specifically on the seasonality factor and its interaction with firms' working capital policies. Now, we have a few numerical examples to illustrate this in the paper. So this is in table 1, panel C and D. And basically here in panel C, we have an average firm with an operating cash cycle of here, this is 0.6, so 60% of the year, where we first look at the expected values of operating accruals and operating cash flows. And here specifically, accruals is working capital accruals in the framework. When there's no seasonality, the expected values of these cash flows and accruals is the same across all quarters. But then once we introduce the seasonality parameter, we can see that in this case, Q1 has the highest cash flows and Q3 has the highest accruals. And these values correspond with low accruals and low cash flows, respectively. Now, when the seasonality becomes stronger, this psi parameter is set to a higher value. Then these differences, the seasonal variation in both accruals and cash flows, become stronger. Now, to give you some idea of what this psi factor means, it basically means that the fourth quarter expected value of sales increases by 50% relative to the other quarters. Now here in panel D, we have a completely different example, and this is more like Amazon, where the firm has a negative cash conversion cycle. Now, what is really interesting here is that when we change the parameters of the working capital, we again see seasonal variation in cash flows across the quarters, but the way this seasonal variation plays out is completely different. So here, right, we have the situation that Q1 is the low cash flow quarter and Q4 is the high cash flow quarter. And the accruals are again completely the flip side. And I said this is consistent, right, with the cash conversion cycle of Amazon. And we can see that the patterns we see for cash flows and accruals are also completely in line with what we see for Amazon. And again, when seasonality in sales strengthens, then the seasonal variation in cash flows and accruals also strengthens. And then we summarize all of this in figure 1.
Would you expect to see the same pattern if you compared manufacturers against retailers? Because manufacturers have to sell to retailers who will resell to customers in the fourth quarter. So if you're comparing a retailer and a manufacturer who doesn't have its own retail outlets, then I think you will find some of this pattern. But I think, again, it's sort of, right, because the timing of the sales is going to be staggered because the retail stores have to get the inventory to put into all their stores. And so that's going to change the timing of these cash flows and all these things.
Exactly. So whenever we change one of these parameters, and apologies for not explaining these before. So in the Chow, Qatari, and Watts framework, this is the profit margin. This is the days sales outstanding. This one is the inventory holding policy. And this one is the days sales, days payable outstanding. So for example, here, if we change the inventory holding parameter, then these patterns in the cash flows across quarters will also change. But this is all conditional on the other parameters. Yeah. So indeed, as you say, right, different firms across different industries will have different patterns. Yeah, because of the underlying parameters changing. Yeah. All right. Well, we summarize these insights in the following graph. So here we have the operating cash cycle, or the cash conversion cycle. This is delta. So whenever this lengthens, so this is on this side we would have Deere, on this side we would have Amazon, right, in the negative space, and here we have the seasonality in sales, right? So clearly there's a correlation between seasonality in sales and the expected seasonal variation in operating cash flows. But again, this is conditional on firms' working capital policies as captured by delta, by the operating cash cycle, which is a summary, right, of the credit terms with customers, suppliers, and firms' inventory holdings. Now then let's look at the data and the empirics. So the empirics are relatively straightforward for the most part. So we use standard measurements, CompuStat crisp sample, and importantly, right, we focus on quarterly measurements of accruals and cash flows. So that means we back out, right, the quarterly cash flows and accruals from the year-to-date values as reported by firms. Sudipta?
So it seems to me you're ignoring the sort of accounting part of the fourth quarter in the model. You're assuming that essentially the relation is constant because we're focusing on just the production flows and this thing, but we do the physical inventory count at the fourth quarter. We do the LIFO adjustments at the end of the fourth quarter. We do impairments of everything in the fourth quarter. So so if you take the ball and Shivako model of accruals and cash flows, then that relation is not linear, but you're assuming that it is strictly linear, whereas we know that it's likely to be more nonlinear in the fourth quarter. And so, it's fine that you're doing this, but it seems like this is a model that probably isn't appropriate given what else we know about accrual accounting and conservatism in particular. But right, and so then is this a sort of viable approach to assume that these relations should be the same
across the 4 quarters? No, I mean that's a very important point. So would your suggestion be to implement like a Ball and Shivakumar specification that allows, right, cash flow, the relation to differ across positive and negative cash flow quarters? Yeah, I mean that's something we can do. So one thing I can say is that when we sort of look at the time trends in this relation and we plot this for the 4 different quarters, we actually don't see a systematic difference across the 4 quarters. Right? Maybe the fourth quarter is a bit weaker, but it's actually the difference is relatively minor in the data at least. But it's definitely something we can consider. Thank you. So, right, as said before, our definition of accruals is operating accruals, and we focus both on operating accruals as the difference between income before extraordinary items and operating cash flows. And then we zoom in on the working capital accruals component. So conceptually, right, this is the one that best matches the operating cash flows. And the reason that we do both is that there are a lot of items that conceptually are part of working capital accruals, but they're actually not part of the working capital accruals as defined in based on CompuStat data, because a lot of the components of working capital accruals are in FOPO, like the allowance for doubtful accounts and inventory write-offs, etc. So we focus on both working capital accruals and on total operating accruals. And then focusing on the measures of seasonal variation, we have one very simple one where we simply look at how extreme is the within year variation in cash flows. And the second one is based on this RFS paper that looks at the seasonality in earnings. So we focus on this measurement, which is basically looking back 5 years in time. It identifies which of the 4 fiscal quarters is the peak cash flow quarter, which is the low cash flow quarter. And then in the current year, we take the difference between those predicted high and low cash flow quarters to indicate or get an indication of how seasonal the cash flows are. Now, as I alluded to earlier, right, most research looks at this relation between the levels of accruals and cash flows. But if you actually look back into the literature, there's no conceptual foundation for this relation. And if you look back at the Chow-Kothari and Watts paper, is there someone who has a question? So if we look back at the Chow-Kothari and Watts paper, there the relation is between changes in cash flows and changes in accruals. Right. So what we do here, I will not touch upon this too much given the time, but the key point here is that it's better to either account for cross-sectional differences across firms or to focus on changes in cash flows and accruals. Now then, descriptive evidence. So what we start with is we look at what does this baseline relation between accruals and cash flows look like. Now, if we look at the annual relation between accruals and cash flows, this is consistent with Bushman et al. The baseline relation between annual accruals and cash flows is essentially 0. But then when we start to zoom in on quarterly accruals and cash flows, we see that the coefficients and R squared from looking at the relation between, or the regression of accruals and cash flows, becomes more meaningful, right? It's negative, more consistent with expectations, and the R squared becomes also more meaningful. And then if we zoom in on the working capital accruals component, we see that all of the action is in working capital accruals, and non-working capital accruals, right, do not display this negative relation with their operating cash flows. And then we take a series of steps to account for cross-sectional variation. So one thing is to use firm fixed effects, which we can do by either taking out the firm effect from cash flows or taking out the firm effect from both accruals and cash flows. We can look at change variables, or we can even use firm year fixed effects by only looking at the within year variation. Now, the key point here is that whenever we do that, we find a much more meaningful relation between accruals and cash flows after we account for these cross-sectional differences. Yeah, and again, all of the action appears to be in the working capital accruals. And then some descriptives on the seasonal variation. So first, we look at the 4 fiscal quarters, and consistent with expectations and consistent with our analytical modeling, right? For most firms, Q4 is the peak quarter. And then we look at the relation between sales seasonality and the seasonality or seasonal variation in cash flows. And again, right, from our analytical framework, we say that these are 2 different concepts. What we do is we sort firms by an estimate of sales seasonality, and then show that indeed there is a correlation between the sales seasonality and the seasonality in operating cash flows. So there's a positive relation. But the magnitude of this relation depends on whether the operating cash cycle is relatively high or relatively low, right? So consistent with the graph that I showed you earlier, the 3D graph, right? This relation between sales seasonality and seasonal variation in cash flows is stronger for longer operating cycles. And then one of the key results, as I said, the empirics are relatively basic in the sense that we look at these basic regressions of accruals, operating accruals, and operating cash flows. And we do that separately for different groups of firms based on estimates of seasonal variation in cash flows. Yeah, so we sort firms into quartiles based on their estimate of seasonal variation in cash flows. And the key result here is that there's a clear link between seasonal variation for a firm and the extent to which we see this timing role of accruals. Yeah, so the coefficient on the operating cash flow variable is more negative, and the R squared is significantly higher, right? So here, for example, we see that for the high seasonal group, the R squared, the adjusted R squared is 0.71. For the low seasonal variation group, it's only 0.16. Now, then we look at industry relations. We find similar patterns across industries. We do double sorts. We find that this effect of seasonal variation is distinct from regular cash flow shocks that have been identified in prior research. And then we move to the time trends. So first of all, we basically do Bushman et al., but then for the quarterly setting, including our corrections for these cross-sectional differences. Now, consistent with Bushman et al., we find a weakening trend in the accrual cash flow relation. But importantly, this weakening is much less dramatic than it is based on annual data, right? So based on annual data, basically, if you would plot this for annual data, all the R squareds would be relatively close to 0, and the coefficient would be trending towards 0. Now here, the coefficient is still quite negative. The R squared is declining over time, so there is this trend. But especially if we look at working capital accruals, or at least changes in working capital accruals and changes in cash flows, we still did the R squared. We see that the R squared is still above 60% at the end of our sample periods. Yeah, so there's a similar trend, but it's much less dramatic when you focus on quarterly working capital accruals and account for these heterogeneity across firms. Now, then again, I think the most interesting part of the paper is what is driving this. So first of all, we identify this role for seasonal variation in cash flows in triggering the accruals that offset the cash flows. And here we focus on what sort of drives this temporal trend in the accrual cash flow relations. Now, consistent with the Amazon graph that I showed you earlier, here this blue line suggests there is a significant reduction in seasonal variation in cash flows over time, right? So based on our estimate, or one of our estimates of seasonal variation, we find that this seasonal variation approximately halves over our sample periods. Now, what is quite interesting is, first of all, the seasonal variation in earnings is much weaker than it is for seasonal variation in cash flows. And again, that hints at the role of accounting accruals. Second, right, the trend in the seasonal variation in earnings is also very different, right? So there's a downward trend in the seasonal variation in earnings, but it's much less dramatic than it is for the seasonal variation in cash flows. And so that means there must be something unique that drives the seasonal variation in cash flows that is changing over time. Now, this is a graph that is not in the paper, but which we still find very insightful, is the following. What we did is we looked at the 4 different quarters of the year and looked at within the year which quarters, what are all the combinations of the quarters. So there are 6 combinations, and for each of these combinations, we looked at the covariance, or the correlation between these quarters. Now, at the beginning of our sample period, the correlation between these quarters in the year is close to 0. But then at the end of the sample period, this rises to almost 80% at the end of the sample period. Yeah, so clearly there's a systematic shift in the extent to which within a year, operating cash flows are correlated across the quarters. Yeah, it goes from almost 0 correlation to a very significant positive correlation. Now then, time trends in the underlying determinants of the seasonal variation. And in this sense, we link back to our analytical framework, which provides sort of the predictions for this. So first of all, we find a general decline in the seasonality in sales of firms, right? So in general, companies become somewhat less seasonal when we focus on their sales. We also find a reduction in the operating cash cycle. So at the beginning of our sample period, this is around 85 days. It drops to below 60 days by the end of our sample period. Then we look at the specific parameters of firms' working capital policies. So we find a general reduction in inventory holdings. Now, this is not a new result, but still, I think it's an interesting result. Sorry, this should be says operating cash cycle, but it should be the difference between days receivables and days payable outstanding. And there we also see like a significant decline over time in the difference between days receivable and payable outstanding. Now then the next thing we do is we try to explore whether we can sort of explain this time trend in the accrual cash flow relation. Right? So here we plot, or we have a regression with 34 regression R-squareds where working capital accruals are the dependent and operating cash flows are the independent variable. And then we simply regress these R-squareds on a time trend. Now, clearly there's a strong time trend that is negative and significant. But once we control for measures of the seasonal variation in cash flows, this time trend disappears. It does not disappear if we control for either sales seasonality, the operating cash cycle, or days sales outstanding. But again, it does disappear when we control specifically for inventory holdings and days payable outstanding. Yeah, so the conclusion from this analysis is that the inventory rate, target rate, and days payable outstanding seem to be providing a reasonable explanation for why we see this trend in the accrual cash flow relation. Of course, this is all based on a regression of 34 observations with highly correlated variables, so we should take these results with a grain of salt. Now, the question is, why do these factors change over time? This is something we need to exert much more effort into in the next few months. But some of these arguments have been mentioned already, like the market power of firms may have changed over time. There's a change in supply chain finance, change in operations of the company, or it could simply be that there are changes in sample composition of the firms in our sample. Now, this is something we do explore in the paper, and what we do is we use the Srivastava cohort analysis. So first of all, if we look at seasonal variation in cash flows, we see that there's mostly a general trend across different cohorts of firms, but especially for the latest cohort of firms, there seems to be a distinguishing pattern, right? With the more recent cohort of firms having systematically lower seasonal variation in cash flows. Now, then the question is, what is driving this? Then again, we go back to the determinants of seasonal variation in cash flows. Now, the changes in sales seasonality seem to be quite systematic across the different cohorts. But then if we look at the operating cash cycle, there we clearly see a cohort effect, with more recent cohorts of firms having systematically lower operating cash cycles. Now, then looking at the specific components of that, now we don't see, we see a small shift in the days sales outstanding, but again, there's no cohort effect. There's a clear cohort effect when it comes to inventory holdings of firms. And then finally, if we look at the days payable outstanding, we see mostly a general time trend, but this is quite interesting. These are the most seasoned firms. So the oldest firms seem to be making a significant shift here in the later periods, having much higher days payable outstanding. So I see, Ayung, you raised your hand. I think I'm running out of time.
I think we are a little out of time.
Yes, I'm sorry.
So we can continue the conversation after, yeah, you wrap up.
Yeah, let me wrap up in 1 minute, hopefully. So as I said before, we also look at these predictive ability tests, and basically what we show is that seasonal variation significantly reduces the predictive ability of cash flows. But then again, if we account for the information in working capital accruals, this predictive ability of cash flows is sort of recovered in a sense. So to conclude, I think a key conclusion of our study is that in contrast to the studies that recently focused on the relation between annual accruals and annual cash flows, we find that accruals play a pronounced role in smoothing temporary timing shocks in operating cash flows. Right? As discussed, one reason is that most firms' operating cash cycles are much shorter than a year. But most importantly, the key contribution of our paper is this seasonal variation in cash flows that we identify both analytically and empirically. And I think then, again, the most interesting part of our paper is these patterns in the changes in the seasonal variation in cash flows, which I think is a novel finding, which we then link back to these changes in the accrual cash flow relation over time. So thank you so much for your attention and for all the questions. This was super helpful. And yeah, we look forward to diving back into the paper very soon. Thank you again.